Hello and welcome to Forward Together, where science, ethics, and religion intersect in a changing world. This is our breakout session on genetics and being human. My name is Dr. Rob O'Malley, and I am project director here at the AAAS Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion program, and I will be moderating this session. To echo what was said at the very start of today's event, I want to gratefully acknowledge all the diverse and vibrant Indigenous peoples on whom ancestral homelands many of us stand. I am joining you from Central Maryland, which is the homeland of the Piscataway and Nacotchtank and Anacostia people. For those in North America, I do encourage you to check out nativeland.ca as a starting point. If this is not something you know much about, to learn what Indigenous communities call your region home and to start learning more about them. I also want to note as we get started that closed captioning is available. You can just click the live captioning button at the bottom of your screen to turn captions on and off and adjust your settings. There will be time for questions at the end, so as we're talking, I invite you to enter your questions in the Q&A button throughout the session. You can also upvote other questions if you see one you really like, and we will get to them as best we can. And also I wanted to remind you that the session is being recorded, as are all of our sessions. So if there's one you missed, you can catch it later. So this session is about genetics, the study of genes, genetic variability, and heredity. How do our genes impact who we are as individuals or as a species? And during this session, we're looking to share and to learn about recent advances in genetics, how genetic research can be applied or misapplied, and how this work can perhaps advance and improve our understanding of ourselves. And I'm very pleased to introduce our two speakers for this session. First, Mr. Noah Collins, who is a medical anthropologist, a bioethicist and scientist at Variant Bio, a Seattle-based company that seeks to ethically leverage the power of human genetic diversity to discover new therapeutics. We're also joined by Dr. Praveen Sethupathy, an associate professor of biomedical sciences and director for the Center of the Center for Vertebrate Genomics at Cornell University. So I'll give each of our panelists a few minutes to share a little bit more about who they are and their work within this field of genetics before we begin our discussion. And so with that, I would like to first introduce Noah. Take it away, Noah.
Awesome, thank you. Osio Nagara, Nawatihara Owori Dawado, Ale Ani Wori Digiwi, Ani Awya Digdale Kwaski, Ale Ani Jodi Gijolagi. So, hi everyone, my name is Noah Collins. I am an enrolled citizen of the Cherokee Nation. I'm also a White Mountain Apache, born and raised on the Cherokee Reservation in Oklahoma. Currently, I'm a bioethicist and a medical or biological anthropologist with Variant Bio. Previously, I was at the Center for Ethics and Indigenous Genomics Research, which is a SEER, an NIH-funded grant out of the University of Oklahoma. I've spent most of my research career, if not all, in broadly Indigenous health disparities. So I was in New Zealand working with Maori communities, looking at the genetics of type 2 diabetes and gout. I'm also a member of the SING Consortium, which is the Summer Internship for Indigenous Peoples in Genomics, which is a really amazing consortium of Indigenous geneticists around the world. So I've worked broadly in precision medicine, genomics research, but I come at these issues much differently than most other scientists do, just because of my emphasis as a community member and having been raised within like a strong cultural foundation. So most recently, my work with Variant Bio is exciting in a lot of different ways. So as a company focused on therapeutic discovery through genomics, we're able to reach out and collaborate with communities that have been historically left out of local research or genomics research in general. So I don't remember the Pope Joy number exactly from the Pope Joy article, but the percentage of genomics that is based on Europeans is overwhelmingly what the focus of genomics has been historically. So we're able to look out and reach out to communities, and it allows us to make really meaningful connections with local researchers, with fellows, and to form projects that are centered on community interest. Beyond that, we're more ethically focused on literally than literally every other genomics company that I've ever heard of. So at Variant, beyond disseminating results or like a publication, which is what you might get with an academic institution, We share clinical information. We're offering therapeutic findings at cost to our partner communities. And we're also offering something called benefit sharing. So benefit sharing is a long-term commitment to engagement with our community partners by sharing 4% of our revenue plus 4% of our equity value with those who share their DNA and their health information with us. So communities need more than that. So we also focus on short-term benefits as a way to allow communities to put impact or to address the topics that they think are interesting or that they think are needing addressing immediately. So we're also actively thinking about things like data governance and sovereignty, which is what a lot of my passions lie here recently in terms of like the changing technology sphere. And then I think to address sort of like one misconception of Indigenous people, as I am an Indigenous geneticist, is people think of us as a monolith, but it's that as a whole, we are uninterested or feel fearful of genetics research. And I would agree that we are suspicious because of how many communities have been lied to or taken advantage of over the history of genetics research. But we're also not being offered anything respectful or frankly worth the weight of our contribution to genetics. So I think the amount of Indigenous geneticists that there are now or are coming up shows and speaks very directly to the opposite of interest from genetics in Indigenous communities. But also a giant error that I see in thought with scientists as a whole, but more frequently with geneticists, is a lack of understanding on how colonial their way of thought is. And what I mean by that specifically is that they conduct extractive research, and instead of engaging with communities, they force their study findings and their worldview onto the people. They also ignore that Indigenous peoples have been scientists actively shaping our environment for thousands of years before Science, the journal, was ever first published. So my role as an Indigenous scientist is to indigenize, and I do not mean decolonize, the gap between science and my people, wherever they may be. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. There will be a lot to return to in our discussion, so thank you for that. All right, and then Dr. Sethupathy, if you could introduce yourself and spend a few minutes talking about who you are and your work in this space.
Sure. Thank you, Rob. And thank you, Noah. It's such a pleasure to share the screen. Normally say share the stage, but share the screen with you. It really is an honor, and I'm looking forward to getting to know you better in the coming days and weeks. So a little bit about me. I am a Christian. I am a scientist. I have a Hindu background, Indian ancestry, Canadian birth, and American citizenship. So I'm a little all over the place. And I think as a result, I'm always attracted to things that don't neatly fit into the bins that we like to create. So I like interdisciplinary endeavors, and I like crossing boundaries as much as I can and learning as much as I can in areas that may not be as familiar to me. I find it always to be extraordinarily enriching, whether it is in my professional life as a scientist or whether it's in my personal life and in my own growth as a human being. So just really briefly about my academic journey, I went to Cornell as an undergraduate, completed my PhD at the University of Pennsylvania in genomics at around the time when the Human Genome Project was coming to fruition. I went on to do postdoctoral studies at the National Institutes of Health and had the privilege of being able to work with Francis during the 3.5 years I spent there. Started my lab at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and then moved it in 2017 to Cornell University, where I am now. And in addition to serving as the head of a research lab in the Department of Biomedical Sciences, I'm also serving, as Rob mentioned, as the director of the Center for Genomics at Cornell. I mention this or reiterate it perhaps because I'm really passionate about using this platform not only to enhance genomics research and collaboration on our campus as it pertains to human and vertebrate genetics, but also to talk about issues that historically we just haven't, right? So Noah touched on some of these, but as an example, how has genetic medicine, or the genetics as a sciences, been used, abused, misused when it comes to the treatment of other kinds of human beings, people who haven't been afforded the dignity that they deserve, and have been used as vehicles for the advancement of scientific research. What are the where does ethics meet genetics, as in terms of research? These are questions that I'm really interested in. I think it's important that we understand our past and the terrible attitudes and the mistakes that have been made within the scientific community, and to think about how we can not only heal the divisions and the chasms that have been formed as a result, but also how can we make a better future? How might we be able to, especially with amazing groups like Noah's group at Variant, how can we work together to be able to leverage science, but also the wisdom and the enterprise of other cultures, including indigenous communities, to be able to bridge these divides, better understand one another, and be able to be mutually enriching for one another. And I think that's the key there, is mutually enriching. And there's a tendency to think that modern scientific and genetic approaches and advances are superior to other kinds, maybe more ancient kinds. But I think there's something for all of us to learn from one another. What are the ways in which we might be able to create forums where we can communicate effectively to one another and bridge those divides? These are things I care about a lot. As a part of that, I'm also really involved in science and faith conversations across the country, whether it be on college campuses or in churches across the country. I'm firmly in the camp that both faith-based worldviews and the scientific enterprise are harmonious, but clearly viewed through the lens of some individuals, they can be rather at odds. And some of those voices have really popularized the notion that they are at odds. And so I think really thoughtful and reflective and humble conversations in that space are really, really important. It's something that I do in partnership with organizations like BioLogos, that some of you may be familiar with. But I'll leave it there and let the rest of the conversation maybe draw out some other things.
Okay, thank you, Praveen. And so as we shift now to discussion, as per our earlier discussions, we'll be shifting to first names. So thank you for permission to do that. And again, I do invite you, if you're listening in, to post some questions in chat, and we will, in the last 10 minutes or so, we will shift to those questions. We've actually already talked a bit about kind of what my first question was, which is sort of what drew you to this work, which I think is a really powerful one, and I really appreciate what you both shared about that. So I think what I would like to ask then is given our audience and sort of given the theme of today's event, if you could talk, if either of you could share, if there's like a specific encounter or experience where in your work in bioethics or in clinical genomic research or scientific research, concerns of community ethics, spirituality became very important. If there was a time when that and maybe unexpectedly when that became really, really important or critical that you needed to navigate or engage with. And I could throw that to either of you.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. Noah? Oh,
yeah, sure. I'll go. So I think a really pivotal time, not just for me, but for, I think, the future of genetics, or the future of looking at intergenetic work. So not just human genetics, which I think the focus of a lot of the current conversations tend to be, is with the Whanganui River in New Zealand. So recognizing the personhood of this river took 160 years of litigation in New Zealand. And it changed the way, this was like 2019 or something, right, that this happened. It changed the way that a lot of Western communities were viewing non-human species or non-human entities. And I think that for genetics work, whenever we're talking about whatever you want to call it, holistic science, epigenetics, permaculture, depending on your field, I think it has a different name, but it's all sort of the same idea of looking at the interactions of genetics or the interactions of environment on people, and how we are actively shaping ourselves. Like, so human behavioral culturally, ecology is the field, but I think that is a really pivotal space for me, specifically recently, in that it means that a lot more people are interested in looking at ways from a different perspective, or at least they're more open to seeing how it could be done. Just as like a off the cuff thought.
Thank you. Yeah, and that definitely resonates with some conversations in some of our other sessions about sort of ecology and our relationship to the world around us. So thank you for that. Praveen, did you want to share something?
Yeah, I think one of the things I would point to, Rob, is very, very early on in my training, one of the things that really drew me to genetics and genomics research is the same thing that gave me pause about the advancement of genetics and genomics research. And it goes back to a quote from Sir William Osler. He's one of the founders of Johns Hopkins Hospital, actually. And back in the 19th century, he has this great quote where he says, "If it were not for the great variability among individuals, medicine might as well be a science, not an art." And he's really pointing to how variability in the human population makes doing medicine really, really challenging. And of course, we're all familiar with the fact that we are operating under generalized medicine and only now starting to get into the idea of personalized medicine and precision medicine, as Noah mentioned. That was very, very exciting to me, that I was living at a time where we can actually make personalized medicine something closer to a reality. But what that means is studying different kinds of human populations. And as I dug into how human population studies have been conducted in the past, I was faced with a really, really terrible history. And one of the first ones that I encountered was the interaction of the Havasupai tribe in Arizona with Arizona State University. I won't go into all of the details given the time, but the way in which their material, their DNA, and their samples were used without their consent for all kinds of studies, including their ancestry, which was very sacred to them, led me to realize pitfalls is a very kind way of describing what happened here, but it led me to realize the really important ethical considerations and cultural awareness that needs to be taken into account as we do this really exciting work of understanding variability in the human population. So much like our greatest strength is often our greatest weakness, I think the thing that excites me the most about where genetics is headed is the thing that I think we need to temper ourselves and really think carefully in community about how we proceed and whether we're doing this in a manner that respects the dignity of the humans that we're interacting with.
I agree with that completely, actually. Sorry, Rob, if you were about to say something. I agree with that completely, but also I think there's a really big framing aspect to that. So a lot of the times when the ASU case gets brought up, they say the Havasupai incident or the Havasupai case. Mm-hmm. It's actually Arizona State University researchers who were the ones who infringed on Havasupai rights. So it's framing not only the situation, but it's framing the question of whose genetic questions are we even asking in the research itself?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I actually wanted to invite you, Noah, if you're comfortable doing so, use a term earlier that I think is really central to what we're talking about, which is data sovereignty. And I wonder if you could just expand for a minute about what that means.
Just a minute. So data sovereignty is actually, so to go back, sovereignty is sort of this idea that we have and a conversation that we have all the time in indigenous spheres, where if you're truly sovereign, it means that you have the ability to govern everything in your purview, right? So you have like legal sovereignty, you have biological sovereignty, data sovereignty. So data sovereignty is giving communities or individuals the right to govern where their data goes to have a say in who has access to their data. So this could be biological data, this could be any number of things. In genetics, for us, it tends to be, you know, the ATs, Gs, and Cs of genetic data. So this is giving communities the ability and providing them, if they don't have it with infrastructure, to actually be able to control their data. So allowing certain researchers or certain types of research to actually engage with their consent.
Thank you. So something you both kind of talked about was sort of you know, questions of sort of who makes decisions about data and involving community voices to ensure that science, you know, like on the wall when you go into AAAS, it says advancing science, serving society. You know, to what extent are we actually living up to that principle? There is, you know, when I sort of look at things like the NIH's All of Us initiative and other programs that are visibly and publicly, you know, making the case for, yes, science, particularly genomic science, has largely been drawing on populations of European descent. We recognize that's a problem. We want to make sure that these enormous, expensive research efforts do in fact have relevance to everyone's health. And there are some real concerns, particularly that have been raised by Indigenous scholars, thinking of Keolo Fox in particular, but others as well, about how that data is being collected and used. I wonder if either of you could expand on that point, like the I guess in a pithy way, the opportunities and the risks of expanding the scope of precision medicine and how we are engaging with more people in this domain of genetics.
I'll let you take that first, Noah.
You know, I was hoping that all of us would get brought up because I love to rag on the project. Because I was actually in some of the tribal consultation processes. And what is meant by consultation is not real consultation if you don't take into account the feedback that the person is giving you, or that the group in this case is giving you. So where all of us is now in terms of Indigenous data is at essentially a standstill. So there have been a lot of Indigenous communities that have voiced concerns, and myself being one of those people in these sessions, about the way that data will be used. So I think that the project itself has the potential to be really, really amazing, right? So we're looking at including 1 million genomes as reference data. So if we're expanding past European ancestry, you need to be taking into account Indigenous voices or other people of color communities, and to see the impact that it could have on interpretation for those communities. So data is not just data. It has, you know, there are these studies that are getting cited all the time that have been reducted, or that, you know, they don't exist anymore on the citation cycle, but they were published at one point, and so these communities are still experiencing and living through these same sorts of histories. I think All of Us has a lot of impact specifically, or it could have a lot of impact on a lot of different communities, so long as those communities have a say with what's happening. And I think that in the case of precision medicine, we need to be making a conscious effort, like we're doing at Variant, to ensure that the voices of people participating are actually being recognized and are following through to make sure that those people are being safe, or safeguarded at least.
Yeah, and I might take an orthogonal perspective to this, sort of zooming out of how it might affect individual communities, and thinking about how, you know, these advancements in precision medicine, how as humanity, how we might be potentially concerned about some of it as well. You know, and a really timely example is the CRISPR-Cas9 genome editing. And I know we don't have a lot of time to get into the details of that, but that's something that, at least in theory, impacts all of us, and all of us ought to be thinking about and reflecting on what that means to us. Obviously, the excitement that surrounds it is warranted. We have the possibility of being able to eradicate sickle cell disease and a whole host of other inherited disorders. I think any of us that are in the business of medicine will, in theory, be excited by these kinds of promising opportunities. But there are veritable challenges, right? Where do we draw the line between what is a disease that we want to tackle as a community versus a feature enhancement? Who gets to make those decisions? We can point to really obvious cases like sickle cell disease, and perhaps that's where we ought to start, at least, right, in having the conversation and go deeper. But they're really, really, really challenging conversations to be had here. And then, not to mention things like access to different communities, and this is a concern, and it comes to all kinds of other medical technologies and treatments. But as we advance in these approaches, we ought to be concerned about who is really going to be able to benefit from them, and what kinds of structures do we need to put in place in order to maximize a benefit across humanity.
Yeah. If I could speak to that too, I think that those are like really valid points. And to make a point that I've been making several times, science is usually not self-funding. I don't see many researchers who fund their own studies like out of pocket. And so depending on who the funding is coming from will also impact like what questions are getting answered or what questions are even being allowed to be asked. I think a lot of these can be addressed by incorporating minorities or the people who have been left out of these studies, like Indigenous researchers. So not just Indigenous from the United States, but Indigenous from other countries or underrepresented groups within the country, because we have these outside research questions that haven't been asked before, usually. And we just need to get the research funding to be able to ask those questions, right? So.
Yeah, money and power are often hand in hand in these fields, and it's always remarkable to see discourse about science shouldn't be political, because of course it always is, and it always has been. So one question. So we have just a few minutes before we shift to the open Q&A with the audience, and there's some great questions there. I did want to give a more general one, which is a little bit open-ended, but that's okay. Is there a misconception that you see in public discourse about genetics that you would really like to address? Whether that's in terms of how people interpret ancestry tests, or what people think a gene is, or how people think heredity works. Like, if there's some misconception that you see out there in the world that you would really like to address here, I invite you to do so.
I've gone first, so you go first this one.
Okay, I'll throw one out there. Again, this is a topic that requires much more time, but maybe it's just a little food for thought. Often when we think about our changing genomes, our evolving genomes, central to that is mutation. Mutation has to occur, and then the frequency of that mutation either it increases or it gets weeded out of the population and you don't see it anymore, and all kinds of forces are at play in shaping the frequency of mutations that arise. We talk in the scientific community about a mutation arising as a random event. And the randomness and the stochasticity that's associated with mutation and genomes changing can sometimes be very unsettling for people, because it makes it feel like we're just random then. We're just a random, there's no order, there's no purpose, there's no meaning to our lives or to our communities or to anything. We're just randomly here, right? And so there's an extension from talking about mutations arising randomly to our existential sense of purpose and meaning. There's a lot in between there, but it's very natural to get to that point and ask those questions. But the way that we talk about randomness, actually, it's just this wonderful tool in biology. And things that appear random to us are actually occurring not in a vacuum, but under specified constraints. where often they end up shaping more or less the same kinds of things, right? It's like development of the human body in the womb. There's all kinds of stochastic processes going on, and yet it's a human body that emerges every time with just a little bit of variation every single time, right? And so, in fact, that randomness is a wonderful tool to bring about diversity in a collection of entities like human beings. And a lot more that can be said about this, but the bottom line is that the notion that randomness implies in biology implies lack of order and meaning and purpose isn't actually true.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think that also resonates with something when I would teach human biological anthropology, I would just emphasize that like it's, genetics are very central and important to understanding, how we develop, and they obviously influence how traits are expressed, but like they're just one input into this very, very dynamic system that involves not only, for example, a developing organism itself, but maternal effects and environmental effects and dietary effects. And so it's one input of many that are interacting with each other in all these complex ways. So yeah, that's great. So Noah, did you want to share one before we jump to the audience?
Yeah, really quickly. It's important to recognize what genetics can do, but it's also very important to recognize what genetics can't do and what is not actually genetics and what is not actually biology. So your direct consumer genetic test does not make you Native American. Just because 23andMe or whatever company has told you that you are Native American percent whatever, based on your saliva sample, does not mean that you are an integrated member of any community. And I get that this gets brought up to me time and time. I'm sure I'll get some comments on it today. People like to talk about their genetic testing and then assume that because there's this biologized idea of race in the United States, that there is some sort of like genetic component to their cultural affiliation or to their political affiliation. And it's just not true. So.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. This was something I believe you talked about in your thesis, which if anyone is interested, they can track it down online. I thought it was great. So, okay, so let's jump to some of these great questions in the from the audience. So one question relates to, and this I think goes back to, we had a brief discussion about sort of gene editing and things like sickle cell. Some religious and spiritual traditions and lineages are profoundly disturbed by the idea of changing our human nature, whereas others are much more open. How do we develop an ethical framework that's inclusive of these diverse perspectives? That is, as we've been emphasizing, I think, is actually responsive to this consultation input from non-scientists in society.
Yeah, I'll let Noah expand on it more, but I do want to just reiterate something Noah said, which I really strongly want to advocate for. Oftentimes when we want to diversify our workforce or diversify our department or whatever, we want to see the spectrum represented in our applicant pool or whatever it might be. But actually feeling belonging and feeling inclusion is a whole nother level of actually feeling like your voice is heard. It's not just that you're there so that we can look across and say, see how diverse we are, but it's that your voice actually has value. And no one's going to feel like their voice has value because I said so. That takes time, where actually the feedback provided by that community is carefully considered, responded to. If the decisions that they would like aren't made, that there's at the very least feedback to them about what some of the competing influences are. It just needs to be partnership, and it just can't be lip service. I mean, I know that sounds very easy to say, but that's got to be the starting point. Is that you got to feel like there's a genuine desire for partnership across different communities so that their voice is represented. Does not mean that everybody's desires are going to be met in every decision. That's not practical, right? But over time, I think that one can make good faith efforts to demonstrate that you're really hearing people and working to address their issues. I don't know, Noah?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that not all representation is equal too. So one of the issues that we get in indigenous spheres, and that's the only sphere I can really speak to because I'm in that, is that we have people who are meant to be included in terms of like creating these frameworks. So they're meant to be included in terms of your diversity department or whatever your institution may be. And they're meant to represent this this cultural group because they're expected to have this frame of thought. And this is something that I talk about in my thesis, if you want to go and find it too. They're meant to have this diversity of thought, which is something that you're seeking them out for. But if they just happen to be a member of that group, but don't actually represent that group, then they're not really doing the part that they were meant to do. So like an example is having very Western ideas of science or very Western ideas of community engagement and being a Native person. I'm not going to say that there is like, this is how Native people feel, but if you're not representing the minority opinion, you're not really being, you're not contributing in the way that you should be contributing or that you were meant to contribute. And I think that is like a very different aspect that doesn't get talked about a lot. But at the same time, if we're going to be creating these frameworks, or if we're going to be creating these ethical structures that are actually engaged, you need to be engaging the people themselves. So that's a really long conversation.
Yeah, and I think it's worth acknowledging, and I don't need to tell you this, but I think it's something I want to bring up, is that this is a very risky position to put people in sometimes, where I think that many particularly Black and Indigenous and other people of color are kind of asked to provide those diverse perspectives, but sometimes those diverse perspectives are not welcome. And so if you are trying to advance in your field or get a job or get tenure or to accurately represent your field in ethical or your community in ethical ways, like these are a lot of intersecting challenges to navigate. And I think that that is a hard position to put people in, individuals and communities. And so I think that that's also something that science at large and scientific institutions really need to grapple with.
For sure. It can
so
also be really dangerous.
Yeah.
Like if you're meant to be the voice for your community and speak out consistently, that can be a really potentially life-threatening position to be in, or job-threatening minimally a lot of the time.
Another questioner referenced, I think, the same study we discussed earlier, the University of Arizona case, where they extracted and used DNA in analyses without the consent of the tribe. I wonder if we could, if either of you could expand on, again, thinking back to kind of the role of the session writ large, how faith communities or spiritual leaders, however that's defined, what role they can have in promoting or supporting the kind of engagement we've been talking about, more inclusive, more responsive, acknowledging power and history and all of these dimensions.
Yeah, I think we're talking about the Arizona State University, not the University of Arizona. Just don't want to.
Sorry. Yes.
No, it's okay. I just wanted to clarify. I do think that there is a role for leaders in the faith community that they can take, but I think it's actually quite complicated. And this is because some faith communities in the past have actually been the drivers of some of the kind of horrific dispossession and assimilation tactics and things like that. So I think we need to be honest about the fact that some faith-based communities have not lived up to the tenets of their faith and have been a part of the problem. And I don't think that we can really plan to be a part of the solution unless we are willing to accept that we've been a part of the problem. I think that has to be the starting point. I think we need to seek forgiveness, and I think we need to accept responsibility. I think those are the first and foremost. I think once those steps have been made in sincerity, then I think we can talk about how the community can actually step in to be a part of the solution, to try to mend the brokenness, to try to bridge the divides. And I do see lots and lots of opportunities, and it's something I'm personally really excited about. But I think I just make it worse if I just dive right in to try to solve problems when I don't, honestly, genuinely reflect and admit on how traditions that I might be affiliated with have been a part of the problem or the very problem itself at times. So I think that's a really important component that sometimes gets missed, and seeking forgiveness and recognizing the roles played in atrocities of the past is vital.
Yeah, I would agree. I would actually make one point more strong, is that representing or like reinforcing roles or recognizing roles. So recognizing the role of an outsider in an in-group, like in one from like a genetic community to the researcher coming in to do research, or recognizing the role of our elders in our research who are representing our views historically, and making sure that in the case of Arizona State University, that the research that is being done in the community is actually represented, like the research isn't infringing on their wants. So yeah, I know we only have 1 minute left, so I won't get too much further. But.
So this is, I just wanted to note that this, thank you so much for your time. We are unfortunately out of time. We are not going to be able to get to all these questions, but we will post them in the meeting forum. And I do invite you both to check in on that if your time permits. And also this, a lot of what we discussed here did resonate with the session on race and racial justice as well. So there's definitely some overlap and points of common ground in terms of the discussion. So we are out of time. Thank you so much for what was, I think, a really fascinating discussion. Of course, there's always more to say and more to engage with. So I'm tremendous on behalf of the program. We're tremendously grateful for your time and attention. And we invite everyone to join us for the plenary in just 8 minutes now, the closing plenary for today. And thank you for joining us. And with that, we will close out.
Thanks very much, Rob and Noah. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.